I'm going to present the first of the three, of a set of three papers that have to do with animal remains in archaeology, dated to this period. So I'm sorry, but I'm going to do a bit of an introduction also to the problematic of zooarchaeology. I'm sure that my other colleagues will expand on this also at their own during their own presentations. As Umberto has mentioned earlier, we've been now working for 2.5 years, more or less, on a project looking at precisely this topic of improvements in animal husbandry during the 16th century in England and in Spain. I am now working on the Spanish material, so I'm going to present here just the evidence that I found so far, very briefly, for the English case. This is a very interesting period to look at agricultural change in England, as it has been mentioned before. As you have seen from other presentations as well, in England, there are traditionally two major events have been considered regarding agricultural change during this whole period. One would be the changes associated with the Black Death around the middle of the 14th century, and the other one would be the British Agricultural Revolution, which traditionally is associated to the 18th century. As Umberto already has mentioned before, this is now debated. However, it is true that this long 16th century, from the middle of the 15th to the early 17th century, is still regarded as kind of a period of stagnation in agricultural change, compared to these two periods of very major changes in agriculture. Although it has been acknowledged that the British Agricultural Revolution was possible because changes happened earlier. However, in England, mainly cattle has been investigated and not so much other livestock species. And this was, people thought that probably this animal was the one that was subjected to more radical improvements or more radical changes because of its direct relation to agriculture. It was the beast that was used for plowing the fields. For this presentation, I have two main questions. I want to know if these innovations were already in place in the centuries before the British Agricultural Revolution, which is a specific focus on the 16th century, this long 16th century, and if these changes affected other livestock species as well, and in what way. I haven't put it here, but I didn't put it here. But so far, most of the zooarchaeological work carried out in England has been carried out on the basis of specific case studies, very large assemblages, but very specific case studies. So in this research, I wanted to look more at England as a whole and see if changes were visible countrywide during the 16th century. So I warned you from the beginning that I'm looking at very general patterns. Of course, there will be specific cases that are not represented here. Why the main research that I'm going to show here is mainly focused on biometry. I want to look at the size increase of livestock during the time. In general, larger animals were perceived by early modern farmers as an improvement for themselves. And I put here a little quote by Fitzherbert in the Book of Husbandry in 1534, in which he literally says that the cow should be as large as possible, proportionless and great, and bull-like, actually, very, very large. A large or an improved animal produces an increased meat yield. In the case of cattle or horse as well, a larger animal would have an increased traction power, and very importantly, genetically improved animals have a faster growth rate, so you can actually slaughter them earlier, and gain the same amount of meat out of their body. So, in functional terms, in economic terms, it's a very great improvement for any farmer. As I said, this research is mainly focused on biometrical analysis, and I'm looking at size and shape change of livestock. And there are different reasons why the size and the shape of an animal can change. very important reason would be genetic modification. It can be a local modification by deliberately selecting some animals for breeding and not others, or it can be due to the introduction of distinct populations or import, trade, and these sort of things. If there is a genetic modification, in the zooarchaeological remains we would be able to see these changes both in the bones and in the teeth. And another major factor that can, or group of factors that can help in the change of size and shape of animals is environmental factors. For example, zootechnical developments. The introduction of new foodstuffs or new feeding techniques, for example, can affect in the size and the shape of animals. And if this is the case, that environmental factors are happening, changes are only visible in the postcranial bones. With this I mean that if we want to check if there are genetic factors behind, we need to look at teeth more than the postcranial bones. As I said, I was looking at very broad biometric changes across England, and thanks to I did the analysis of several of these sites, but I also counted with a very much appreciated help by other researchers who gave me the raw data so that I could do this comparison. And I ended up with very good assemblages from, I think there are 13 different sites across England, different regions, different types of sites. Many of them are urban, but I do have as well some castles. Unfortunately, not so much rural sites, but this is something that Tamsin will talk about later. And I put this map also to show you that I'm really looking at England as a whole, not very specific regional patterns. I looked at 4 different species, the main livestock species, so cattle, sheep, pig, and chicken. I took different measurements, mainly widths, lengths, depths, and whenever possible also teeth. Unfortunately, only an important sample size for of teeth was available for pig. And I grouped all the measurements in 3 major periods. One would be the late Middle Ages, another one would be the long 16th century, which is the period that I'm mostly interested in, and the post-16th century, which would go until the mid-18th century. In total, I got 17,570 measurements, which is an awful lot of data to play with. And I'm going to show you here just very summarizing results of this research, starting by cattle. In the following slides, the structure of the slide is more or less the same, but with different species. So first I'm showing you 3 graphs with the different measurements, axes of the measurements. So widths, lengths, and depths of the postcranial bones, and they are in each of the graphs. The box plots represent the different chronological periods. So the first one would be late Middle Ages, the second one would be the 16th century, and the third one is post-16th century. And I've added some arrows here for you to visualize what I want to say. In the case of cattle, in all of the axes, there is an increase in size throughout the period, but also in the 16th century. The statistical analysis carried out here also shows a very significant differences between the periods. In the case of sheep, as I said, the structure of the slide is exactly the same. I see exactly the same pattern. There is an increase in size, and already in the 16th century. And the statistical analysis as well shows very highly statistical significance. For pig, as I said, I was lucky enough to have enough teeth data. And as you can see, the pattern is slightly different. So for the postcranial bones, the pattern is similar. I have a continuous increase in size, including the 16th century. But for the teeth, there is an increase in the 16th century, and then there is a decrease in the post-16th centuries. The statistical analysis for the transition between the late Middle Ages and the 16th century shows very highly statistical significance. Not so much for the transition between the 16th century and the post-16th century. for the postcranial bones. But for the teeth, really this change, this decrease in size, it is statistically significant. And last, chicken. Only postcranial bones, they don't have teeth. There is an increase in size through the 3 periods. And again, the statistical analysis shows quite a good statistical significance. Not so well for the transition between the 16th and the post-16th century, but this is due to a smaller sample size. I think the graphs are good enough to show that there is a change. To conclude, all the historiography about this period shows that England during this period was very regionally diverse in terms of animal husbandry. So I want to stress that this that I just show is a very large regional pattern. There are regions in which these changes happened earlier, there are regions in which these changes happened a bit later. But I wanted to look if in the 16th century these changes were already widespread in England as a whole. And it seems so. All the evidence I have is that show that there is an increase in size of all 4 domesticates throughout post-medieval times, but that much of this improvement already happened in the 16th century. And why this happened? I think that there is a combination of environmental factors and genetic factors. In this period, new foodstuff is being introduced, forage crops, carrots and turnips. And also there is a change on feeding techniques or keeping techniques towards more stalling or sty farming. All these allowed a much closer control of the food intake and the breeding of the animals. And remember, if you remember this slide in which I was telling you that in order to look at genetic changes, we need to look at teeth. Well, at least for pig, we do have the evidence that there is a genetic change in this period. Probably from a combination of an improvement of local breeds and the importation of foreign breeds, larger breeds. For example, through the written sources, we know that by the 16th century, long-legged cattle are being imported to England from the Netherlands. So although the evidence that I've shown here, it applies only to to pig, I think that probably was the case for other livestock species as well. I didn't have the time to show it here, but I do have also very good evidence of a progressive reduction of the age and death of all livestock species. And this is related to this other improvement, very important improvement that I was mentioning earlier, that these animals are really fast-growing animals. You can slaughter them much earlier and gain the same amount of meat out of them. To wrap it up, this is a period of improvement, intensification and sophistication of animal husbandry techniques for increasing labor productivity and for increasing also agricultural efficiency. This is probably related to an increase in demand of animal products. And as I've said earlier, although some of these changes are visible at particular sites earlier in time, even in the 14th century, it was not until the 16th century when these changes became widespread all over England and caused substantial long-lasting transformations that modernized England's economy. And that's it. Thank you very much.